guys, today we're going to talk about doing an intake questionnaire with your client. This is going to be your very first appointment with them, and so I want you to start out just by making them feel comfortable, maybe asking how their day is going, doing some small talk, and then tell them what you're going to be doing today. That you're going to be asking some pretty logistical questions. You're not going to get really deep today. Today is strictly about building a relationship with your client and creating a safe space for them to feel like they can share. Sometimes I'll even let them know that when we get to a question that might be personal, I'll warn you first so you'll be prepared. Go ahead and tell your client why you're doing an intake questionnaire. This is for history gathering. This is to help you put together a customized plan for their healing. This is also about just getting to know each other better. So let them know that is why you're asking all these questions today. And throughout the course of the session, be sure and let them know how much you appreciate their vulnerability and just encourage them all along the way. It's really important when you print out this intake form that you only print on the front half of the page. Leave the back of the page open for you to take notes. Also, another thing I do is I jot up here in the top right corner what they're going to be paying for this session and how they're going to be paying. And that way, if different clients pay through different venues, I don't have to remember it. I can look it up on their intake. So be sure and jot that down. I'm not going to go over every single question today. I'm just going to share with you some things that I may do a little different than what your intake says. For example, when you're talking about different areas, I want you to tell them what you're going to ask them and then ask them. So for instance, I might say, let's talk about your employment. I may ask questions about that, and then I might say, well, how long have you been working there? Do you like your job? And just embellish it a little bit, because we want this intake to be more conversational than it is questions and answers. Also, when you ask about, now we're going to talk about your education, just want to know how much education have you had? Did you graduate from high school or college? So you want to start low, because it can be embarrassing for someone if they don't have much education. So be careful that you're sensitive how you ask these questions. You want to find out if they've been to counseling before. And then I usually say, let's talk a little bit about your spiritual background. And I'll ask them these questions on the intake. I may also ask them to tell me about their salvation experience. I just kind of am led by the Spirit on that one. But if there's any church hurt, especially from pastors or leaders, tell them you don't want any details today, but just give you their first name and just a very brief summary of what happened, and write that on the back. I also want to encourage you, every time you feel that there is a source of trauma, put a big star by that source, so that when you come back to make your list of sources for them, it'll be really easy for you to find those sources of trauma because you put a big star there. We're just going to do the first 3 pages of the intake at the first counseling session. So page 2 is pretty important. I definitely want you to find out if they have any significant illnesses, injuries, disabilities, chronic pain, because those things can be sources of trauma. It's also important for us to know any prescription meds that they're on. Now, it's good for them to tell you the name of the med and the reason they're taking it. And sometimes they even will tell you how many milligrams. Some people don't know that, but you don't necessarily have to know the name of the med, but you need to know what they're taking it for, because any medication that alters the brain can be counterproductive to the process. So we want to make sure that we're aware what they're taking so that when they begin doing their reprocessing and grieving, that they're able to grieve. Because grieving, as you know, is one of the main keys to healing the brain. If you see that your client is not grieving during their sessions at all, you may want to talk to them about that. Let them know what the 3 keys to healing are: vulnerability, empathy, discovering loss, and grieving those losses. If they're not able to grieve, they may need to speak with their psychiatrist or their doctor who prescribed the drug, and let them know what they're doing, that they're doing a method of counseling that requires grieving, and could they maybe reduce the dosage a little bit. So that's why that's important. And then I'll tell them that I want to talk about their sleep and their diet. So go ahead and ask those questions. And then I will say, at this point, I will say I'm getting ready to ask you some very personal questions. But I want you to know that this is a judgment-free zone, that I either have done some of these things myself or I've had several clients who have. So I want you to feel safe answering these questions. And this is when you're going to ask them about alcohol, drugs, and any hardcore drugs. The main thing you want to do is find out the first time they drank, the first time they did drugs or smoked cigarettes, because that is a clue to trauma in their life. Usually these things happen as a result of trauma. So if they drank and did drugs and smoked weed or whatever at 15, you can rest assured something happened to them in those years, 13, 14, 15, that would cause them to want to do these things. These are things that numb the pain that they have suppressed. Now we'll move on to page 3. Page 3 is not as important to me. I will only ask these questions if I think that a client is approaching menopause. The only question on this page that is very important for men and women is to ask, how many times in your life have you been pregnant or responsible for a pregnancy? And you need to ask that second part of the question. You may want to say, now I need to ask you something personal. What was the outcome of those pregnancies? And this is when they'll tell you if they've had an abortion, a miscarriage, or if they birthed every pregnancy, or if they adopted a child out. And all those can be sources of trauma. You want to end this first intake with letting them tell you again. They may have told you on your phone call or your first initial contact, but ask them again in their own words to tell you why they reached out to you at this time in their life and what do they hope to get out of the counseling. And just jot down everything that they say as much as you can. And be careful, guys, when you're taking notes, not to always be looking down, but take your notes while you're looking at your client. And really, that's about it. I want you to be sure and start every appointment with a prayer. And that first prayer is to invite the Holy Spirit into the session. And then end every session by saying, how can I specifically pray for you this week? And be sure and jot down their prayer request. Be sure and date your notes. And be sure and end with letting them know what they're going to be doing in their session next week. That is one of the last things you'll do. So thank you for watching to the bitter end, and have a great day.